let's talk loyalty. Not the warm, fuzzy kind we associate with our friends, but rather the "you can't be an independent country" kind from the 1770s. In today's video, we're going to be discussing 3 gentlemen that identified as loyalists as defined from yesterday's video. There are 3 pages worth of text on these guys, but don't worry, we're not going to read all of it. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things for you. How this will work is we'll talk about each of these fellows, and then we'll pause and take some notes down in our history workbook or on a piece of binder paper. And with each of these guys, there are 3 key pieces of information that we need to make sure we get down. 1, what was their job or occupation? 2, what actions did they take that made it really clear that they were definitely loyalists? And 3, what were some of the arguments that they had in order to support their reasonings? And this is the big one here, because as 5th graders, we know that anything worth arguing about, it absolutely needs some evidence to support it. Alrighty, let's start with a man who needs no introduction. Actually, wait. He does need an introduction because you guys have never heard of him. Behind door number 1, we have Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Right off the bat, I'm sure you can tell what this guy does as a living based on his title. That's right, he is a governor. But he's not just any governor from any old state. He is the governor of Ground Zero for bothered colonists. That's right, he is the governor of Massachusetts. He was selected as governor by King George III in 1771, which puts him in charge of the colonists 2 years before the Boston Tea Party. And before he was even put in charge, Hutchinson here was a huge fan of our good old friend the Stamp Act of 1765. I mean, just look at this face. You know this guy loves to annoy colonists with that smug look. Ugh. Because of this, our pals the Patriots took severe action. Take a look at what the textbook says. As an official serving the king, Hutchinson firmly believed in enforcing British laws such as the Stamp Act of 1765. Patriots were furious about the Stamp Act. One night, an angry mob burst into Hutchinson's house. The mob stole his possessions and broke furniture. They also destroyed his prized collection of books. From then on, Hutchinson was a bitter enemy of the Patriots. So before he was even in charge, Thomas Hutchinson had some pretty big beef with these colonists. Politics aside, it's pretty easy to join the opposition when personal property is destroyed. But that's why we're here, to talk politics. That's the whole point of this video. Why did this guy pick the loyalist side? Well, the text does a pretty good job of explaining that to us. As a loyalist, Hutchinson believed that the colonists could not govern themselves without the British king and government to guide them. Hutchinson also wrote that British people who lived overseas, such as the colonists, could not expect to have the same freedoms that British people in Great Britain enjoyed. Essentially what he's saying is, look, y'all chose to live here, and we think Great Britain needs to keep an extra eye on you just in case. And if we know anything about the colonists by now, we know that they didn't take this in a civil way. In 1774, some patriots embarrassed Hutchinson by printing some letters that he had written to the British government. The letter said that Great Britain should be tougher on the colonists. When the colonists read his letters in the newspaper, many more of them turned against him. They became convinced that getting fair treatment for the colonies from Great Britain was not possible. Not a good look for this guy. Before we move on to our next loyalist, let's pause for a second and take some notes. I'll put them up here on the screen for you, so feel free to pause this video to make sure you get them all written down. Okay, so we know our friend Thomas here is the governor of Massachusetts and was a big fan of enforcing British laws. The reason he was a loyalist and didn't want independence is as follows. The British king knows what is best for the colonists because he has experience and wisdom. And colonists living overseas should not expect the same freedoms that people in Great Britain have. Got all that? Good. Moving on then to contestant number 2, Jonathon Voucher, the religious loyalist. Reverend Voucher here falls under one of the categories we talked about in yesterday's video. This guy was a member of the Church of England, but what's interesting is his backstory. According to the text, he was a little guy in the colonies, but then moved back to England to become a priest. Then after that, he moved back to North America to the religion-friendly colony of Maryland, where he became quite the religious leader. Despite his look, yikes, he was actually a pretty intelligent and charming guy, and he was one of those guys that spoke whatever was on his mind, no matter what people thought of him. As my good friend Spider-Man here learned from Uncle Ben,
with great power comes great responsibility.
Being a preacher in the 1700s meant that this guy had a lot of power and influence over the colonists, and he knew that. Voucher preached that the king's power came from God and that Christians had a special duty to obey British laws. Disobeying the king was like disobeying God. Basically, his whole argument here is that God was the one making the laws and that these laws were designed to allow safer and more comfortable lives for the colonists. The text also includes another argument from Voucher that actually makes pretty good sense. Finally, Voucher warned that working for independence was dangerous and would lead to a war with Great Britain. Such a war would hurt thousands of people far worse than living with a few unfair laws would. Voucher was definitely onto something here, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have plenty to learn before we get to that era of history. Again, due to his title, his occupation is pretty easy to identify, and in turn this makes identifying his actions pretty easy too. Voucher preached that disobeying the king was like disobeying God. The arguments he made, at least the first one, make pretty good sense. He said that a war for independence would hurt the people much more than living with a few bad laws would. He also said that the common people are not capable of ruling, and British laws come from God and make life safer and easier for colonists. So that just leaves us one last Loyalist contestant behind door number 3. Let's meet him now. Presenting to you, Lord Dunmore, Loyalist governor from Virginia. His real name is John Murray, but he was from a noble Scottish family and was actually a member of Parliament before becoming governor of Virginia. So this falls under the no-duh category of why he's a Loyalist. He was literally a member of Parliament. Anyway, this guy was super rich, and he made sure you knew it based on what he was wearing. I mean, he's got this little cool hat here. He was also really stubborn and bad-tempered, which is just not a good combination when dealing with angry colonists. Dunmore believed that if he came down hard on Virginia, then maybe the colonists would start behaving. But Virginia took a page from the book that Boston was apparently reading and got even more upset at Dunmore for this. In fact, the Virginia colonists got so angry that Dunmore started to get a wee bit scared. And so he reacted in a way that to me seems a little overboard. Dunmore began to fear for his family's safety. In June 1775, he moved them onto a British warship. He then gathered a number of warships and sent them to attack patriots along the Elizabeth River. He promised to free any slaves owned by the rebels if the slaves fought against the patriots. A number of enslaved Africans joined the fighting in order to gain their freedom. This whole freedom and protection for the slaves was essentially what Dunmore was going for the entire colony. He believed that any colonist that wasn't a loyalist was a traitor to Great Britain and should therefore be punished for it. This was where the whole coming down hard on Virginia thing comes into play. Dunmore had a few more reasons as to why he was a loyalist, but we'll fill those out in our notes. So for a third and final time, let's pause the video here and you can make sure to get all the notes filled in. Dunmore's occupation was the governor of Virginia, and in that role he attacked patriots' homes and plantations along the Elizabeth River in Virginia. Bit of a hothead, this guy. The main reasons he was a loyalist is as follows. He claimed that colonists have a duty to obey British laws and not become traitors. Fighting for independence would hurt the economy and make colonists poor. And finally, Great Britain started the colonies and still protect them, so the colonists have a duty to obey British laws. Guys, that's going to do it for our daily dose of history. A bit longer of a video, but we had a lot to cover in it. Make sure you have all your notes written down here because, as I said in Monday's video, these notes are going to be extremely helpful once Thursday's journal response is assigned to you. And be sure to tune in tomorrow because we're going to be talking about our fearless patriots, and I promise you I'll keep the football team references to a minimum. But with that being said, that's all I have for you today, so I'll see you right here tomorrow.